Hi everybody, afternoon and welcome. Great to see so many people here. I'm just going to do a very brief introduction to our chair, Andrew Webb, who is going to chair the event, and then Andrew will introduce Helen shortly. So I'm going to introduce Andrew in a moment, but just to say as well, after the talk there is wine in the cafe afterwards, and I hope you will join us for a drink afterwards with further questions. We've got about an hour for this session, but we'll see how we go. So I'm really delighted to host this event here in the department, and delighted that Andrew is going to chair. Andrew Webb, who is, I could give a very long introduction to Andrew, but that's not the main purpose of today. But Andrew is a previous director or head of the Association of Directors of Children's Services, president, I think is the technical title, and also a friend of the department and the chair of the advisory group for our Big Nuffield project. So I've been delighted to work with Andrew on a number of things. So I asked Andrew to chair the event today, and I'll now ask Andrew to pick us up.
Right. Thanks, Leon, and thanks very much to the department for organising this. It's absolutely couldn't be more timely, as Helen will no doubt explain with her report out, which promises to find ways to fix the SEND problem. No pressure there then. So we're all absolutely waiting with bated breath. I mean, Helen, for those of you who don't know, is MP for Dulwich and West Norwood and chair of the Education Select Committee. And this was one of, I think, 5 reports you've produced since you took up chairing the committee, and it is, I commend it in full to anyone who hasn't read it yet. Yeah, and you can even delve into all the evidence if you wish. But before we get into that, I just thought I'd say a little bit about the context of our SEND reforms, because as Leon said, I'm a former director of Children's Services, director of Social Services, director of Adult Services. Before that, I was a middle manager, strategic leader in various places, and social work practitioner. And as a practitioner, back in the late 1970s, I had a caseload of a mixed caseload, generic it was called at the time. And I had a bit of a specialism with children with learning disability and their families, and adults with learning disability. And at the end of the 70s, Mary Warnock published a report which became the 81 Education Act, which turned the way we thought about children with complex needs on its head. Up until then, my caseload had files going back 10, 15 years into the 50s and 60s. And today they need to come with a trigger warning for a new social worker. The language in them was absolutely atrocious. The judgments being made, the values that were being put forward as good practice, underpinning lack of value for people with disability, absolutely horrific. But some of the services were quite good. So we had a construct that the Warner report turned on its head, which was binary: you're either handicapped or not handicapped. If you're handicapped, you qualify for certain services. If you're not handicapped, you really stood to win a lottery if you were in some local authority areas, or not if you're in others. And I just wondered how much had really changed since the Warner report put the idea of a continuum of need and inclusion and a requirement for schools in local areas to have inclusion policies, not what they were called at the time, how much had really changed. And I think there's been a massive shift. That binary definition, the construct of handicapped, carried right through to the 89 Children Act, and to some extent was replicated in the 2004 Act. So all those sort of general children in need principles still had a bit of legacy of you have to fit in a box to get a service, and if you don't fit in the box, the service you get is likely to be less than ideal. And our schools, our institutions generally were slow to react to the challenge, the intellectual challenge of pupil-based, individually based packages of care and learning. but we're seeing gradual improvements. But the primary tool of the 81 Act was the Statement of Educational Needs, the education statement, which became embodied as a statement of educational needs. It required multidisciplinary contribution to its creation, but it became a bit of a ticket for parents to demand a more appropriate, holistic approach to delivering services for their children. And it created more specialism in schools, and it created much more categorization of children, which is a good thing in as much as specialisms in psychology and education developed fast to ensure that we better understood conditions. But equally, if you didn't fit into a box or there wasn't a service created around your particular definition, you were in a less good place. So we then had the movement up to the Education Act of 81, followed by the 2014 Act, a long period of gradual growth. And what we got with the Act, which I'm going to hand over to Helen to dissect really, was a series of decisions taken with the best of intentions to strengthen a rights-based approach, to create the education, health and care plan, to require local authorities to meet the needs of children as set out in their education, health and care plans. But it has not worked well. And Liam referred to me as president of ACS. I was president when that was going through the bill stage. So I met Evan Timpson, the junior minister who was leading it through on a regular basis. And at no point did he lose faith in trying to achieve a better result than the previous Act had delivered. But what he did was discover on a regular basis that in meeting the needs of one group, apparently he would set up a problem in meeting the needs of another group. So the parent groups he'd meet on 1 week had a completely different set of demands of the system than the parent group he would meet the following week. And he really was inclusive in the way he went about trying to find things, to find ways of solving the issues that were being presented to him. But what we know about changing systems is it is really difficult, even at a local authority level. And one of the things you have to have if you want to change the system effectively, sustainably, is a common purpose shared by all the people who lead it. And one of the biggest issues that Edward Timpson found in pushing through his set of reforms was the parallel universe schools reform, which was creating a fragmented education system, the academies with less accountability of local authorities, curriculum and inspection, pursuing a completely different set of principles than the inclusive principles that you would need to deliver what's in an education health care plan, or indeed that additional support that you should be receiving without going into the complexity of creating a plan. So you had one schools system, one inspection system, one accountability system, which both explicitly and inadvertently was pushing the attainment agenda and creating exclusions. And on the other hand, you had a system that was built around identifying need and flexibly meeting need. And it was the inability of the system to cope with those two approaches at the same time, which, in my opinion, as a then director of education, as defined by the Director of Children's Services definition, I had impossible conversations with my head teachers. 115 head teachers all had their agenda to meet, and the delivery of additional support with or without a plan was a challenge when they looked at all those issues that they had to face. Now, Helen, I'm going to hand over to you because your report looks back over those 10 years and really, I think forensically, identifies what went wrong, perhaps, and what we could do better.
Good everybody, and thank you to Andrew for that warm introduction. Can I say hello to the online audience as well? I can see some familiar names on the screen there, and it's great to have you with us as well. It's a real honour to have been invited to give this lecture today. I've been familiar with Leon's work for quite a long time now, and he's produced some of the most important evidence-based work on children and young people of our generation, I think, both here in Oxford and in previous roles in government. So I welcome this opportunity today to exchange ideas on one of the most significant failures, I think, of children and young people in modern times, which is the crisis in our SEND system. Before I do that, a word of introduction about the Education Select Committee. We are a cross-party group of MPs. There are 11 MPs on the committee, and our role, which is established in law, is to scrutinise the work of the Department for Education. We have a majority of Labour MPs because all select committees reflect the political makeup of the House of Commons, but we have Conservative and Liberal Democrat members too. And the specific thing that select committees do that is different to anything else that goes on in Parliament is that we look at evidence and we reach cross-party agreement. So what you never want to do in the select committee, if you can possibly avoid it, is to have a vote on a report, because there are all sorts of other places in Parliament where people can vote and the party that is in the majority can win. The role that we play is different to that. It's a cross-party role, and it is very much about looking at the evidence. The way that we scrutinise government is by undertaking inquiries into different areas of government policy, and we set our own work programme. As a newly elected committee chair just over a year ago, I was very clear that the crisis in our SEND system was the single biggest challenge in the whole of the education system, all the way from the early years through to post-16 education, and that we must prioritise an early inquiry on SEND. I also wanted to do more than simply provide a commentary on the current state of the system. SEND is a really complex area of policy. The challenges are very significant, and the effectiveness of reform really, really matters to children and their families right across the country. So I wanted my committee to make a contribution to the debate about how to reform SEND and to be helpful to the government in doing so. Our SEND inquiry was launched a year ago in December 2024, and we set out to focus on solutions, investigating how to achieve both short-term stability and long-term sustainability for the SEND system, and even more importantly, how to improve experiences and outcomes for children and young people with SEND. We received over 890 pieces of written evidence, and I'm told by our clerks who've worked on many different inquiries and many different committees, but that is a very high number by comparison with most select committee inquiries. We held 7 oral evidence sessions in Parliament, where we heard in person from a wide range of witnesses, including parents and carers, teachers, local authorities, health professionals and legal experts. And we received compelling evidence from a panel of young people with recent experience of the SEND system, leaving us in no doubt about how children and young people are being failed by the system as it is currently. In our final oral evidence session, we heard from Catherine McKinnell MP, who was then the Minister of State for School Standards before the reshuffle. And to inform our inquiry further, we visited Ontario in Canada to learn how inclusive mainstream education is provided in quite a different system, as well as Aylsham High School in Norfolk and City College Norwich, to observe how they support pupils and students with SEND. So we are grateful to everyone who took part in our inquiry by sharing their professional or lived experience, or by hosting visits and giving evidence in person or in writing. I'll talk a lot in this lecture about the special educational needs and disabilities system, about funding, assessments, plans and support, professionals, settings, tribunals, accountability and interventions. But it's important to remind ourselves that amongst the detail, the nomenclature, the legislation, and the description of failing systems and processes, always in this debate, what we are actually talking about is meeting the needs of children. We're talking about the child whose autism means that a school corridor or dining room can be completely overwhelming. A child whose dyslexia means that while they can speak really fluently, getting it down on paper takes much longer. A child whose ADHD means they can struggle to regulate their emotions. A child whose cerebral palsy means they need a step-free environment. A child whose fetal alcohol syndrome has caused problems with memory and concentration. And a child with profound and multiple learning disabilities who needs to be in a specialist place where healthcare as well as education can be provided. We are talking about children who have a right to education, to a secure and happy childhood, to make friends and to feel that they belong in a community. We are also talking about parents and carers who do not start their child's journey in education wanting a particular plan or document or process, but only for their child to be happy, to be understood and well supported in school, to receive a good education, to fulfil their potential and to leave school equipped to succeed in the next stage of life. Our education system should be able to deliver these expectations. It is really not too much to ask. But there is no doubt that currently the special educational needs and disabilities system is failing far too many children and their families, as well as creating intense pressure on local authority funding, schools and other settings. As Andrew mentioned, the 2014 Children and Families Act introduced major reform to the system used to identify and support children and young people with SEND, introducing new statutory rights, education, health and care plans, and a distinction between statutory and non-statutory support. This reform happened at the same time as other major changes to education in England, led by the then Secretary of State, Michael Gove, which shifted both powers and funding away from local education authorities and towards arm's length academies and free schools. Instead of academies being used as a tool for the improvement of underachieving schools, often in urban areas, as they had been under the previous Labour government, the Gove reforms introduced a drive to convert every former local authority or faith school to an academy. This left local education authorities with the statutory responsibility to deliver a school place for every child in their area and to meet their statutory responsibilities for children with SEND, but increasingly over time, without the tools at their disposal to do so, unable to influence admissions policies, school place planning, or to directly commission or deliver new mainstream or specialist schools. And the problems caused by these flaws in the system, the disconnection between responsibilities and the levers to fulfil them, have only become more acute because since the Children and Families Act 2014, the number and proportion of children and young people identified with SEND has increased significantly. Such an increase within a system that is not well equipped to respond to it has precipitated a variety of challenges around capacity, support, teacher preparedness, multi-agency collaboration and local authority finances. Taken together, this is widely accepted as a crisis of the SEND system. I have to say there is sensitivity about talking about a crisis. It can sound like absolutely everything is a disaster, and that is clearly not the case. There are plenty of examples of professionals, schools and local authorities working exceptionally hard to deliver really good practice. There are children with SEND whose needs are met and who thrive in school. But when we take the scale of those families who have to battle for support, of children stuck on waiting lists, and of the financial strain in local authorities and schools, there can be no doubt that this is not a system functioning as it should, in which it is far harder than it should be for children to access support and for professionals to deliver it. So my committee is clear that it is not an exaggeration to talk about a crisis. We ambitiously titled our inquiry Solving the SEND Crisis. At the start of the inquiry, we were not clear that we would find solutions that could solve the crisis. But by the end, all of us on the committee were convinced that there are solutions and that it is possible to build a system that works much better than the one we have at present. I think it's worth just dwelling on the increase in need for a moment. In the 2024-25 academic year, over 1.7 million pupils in England were identified as having special educational needs, with just under 500,000 pupils having EHC plans. 1,280,000 were receiving SEND support but without an EHC plan. And that represents a 20% increase in the decade since 2015-16. The total number of EHC plans has more than doubled in that same decade, rising from 240,000 to 640,000. The question of why that increase has occurred so dramatically was not part of the terms of reference for our inquiry. And there isn't a comprehensive answer, but I know that probably some of you are working on exactly that question. There is good academic research going on to try to answer that question at the moment. But a recent National Audit Office report points to a combination of 4 hypotheses: greater awareness and understanding of conditions within families, the medical profession and schools, a cultural shift towards greater acceptance and support for those with SEND, conditions and needs that are changing, potentially accelerated by the impact of COVID-19, although actually the incidence of social and communication needs had started to increase before the pandemic. And we can, I think, throw into that category the influence of children's use of phones and online, which is also not particularly well understood. And finally, systemic incentives for schools to request EHC plans for pupils to access high needs funding or transfer pupils to special schools. We had evidence from Dr. Luke Zivieta at the Institute for Physical Studies, who said it is autistic spectrum disorders, speech, language and communication needs, and social and emotional mental health needs, including ADHD, that is driving the increase, and that's really consistent across local authorities and across regions. Whatever the reasons, there are more pupils in every type of education setting with SEND, and the fact that we have a crisis in the provision that is intended to meet their needs implies that the education system as a whole is not currently well designed or designed as well as it could be to meet the needs of all of the children who are already in it. So just for a moment, let's just set out what is the support that's currently available. There are 3 levels of support available in mainstream schools through a graduated approach: ordinarily available provision, SEND support and EHC plans. That these are set out in the SEND Code of Practice. The aim is to ensure that support is proportionate to need, moving from inclusive classroom practice to more targeted and specialist interventions and specialist places as necessary. Ordinarily available provision refers to the inclusive, high-quality teaching and everyday adjustments that all schools and settings are expected to provide for all pupils, including those with mild or emerging SEND, provided by class teachers and teaching assistants, and not requiring any formal identification of SEND. SEND support, the next level, is for children who need additional help beyond ordinarily available provision. This includes more targeted interventions and individualised support. Often involves the school's SEND coordinator, the SENCO, and can involve external specialists such as speech and language therapists and educational psychologists. And then level 3, the EHC plan, which is a legal document issued by the local authority for children and young people aged 0 to 25 with complex and long-term needs that cannot be met through SEND support alone. The local authority coordinates the plan with input from professionals, the setting, the family and the child or young person. And the purpose of the plan is to ensure coordinated, legally enforceable support across education, health and care services. But often that is the process as described and as it should work. Often it doesn't work in that way. Delays are a huge problem. The system is not intended in law to require a diagnosis in order for the support that a child needs to be delivered, including an EHCP, but it is a characteristic of a system in crisis that all too often assessment and diagnosis are being required and support is not provided while everyone waits for that to take place. As an example, delays in the wait for an EHCP, a process which has strict statutory timescales which should be adhered to, have worsened in recent years. In 2024, only 46% of EHC plans were issued within the statutory 20-week timeframe, compared to around 60% between 2018 and 2021. 60% for a statutory requirement is also not a good level of compliance. These delays are in part due to increased waiting times to see specialists such as speech and language therapists and educational psychologists, and I'll talk about workforce in a little bit. Families can challenge individual decisions made by local authorities about EHC plans through the SEND tribunal. The most recent statistics show that only 2.5% of local authority decisions on EHC plans were appealed at tribunal in 2023-24. However, of these, the tribunals found partly or wholly in favour of parents and carers in 99% of cases. Local authorities told the committee that decisions not to issue an EHC plan or to offer less support than is needed are often driven by limited resources, capacity constraints, or a lack of authority to compel other services into action. These reasons, while they are material for local authorities, are not valid justifications for failing to meet strict statutory obligations. And this explains why, when parents and carers go to a tribunal, their success rate is so high. There's a lot of discussion in this field about the tribunal success rate. And while it's important to remember that we are talking about only 2% of cases, it is a further symptom of a system that is in crisis. So what are the consequences of the failure of the system? Parents and carers consistently report that their children's school attendance is negatively affected by the lack of appropriate support for their SEND within educational settings. Pupils with an EHC plan had a suspension rate of 26%, slightly lower than the rate for those receiving SEND support at 29%. In comparison, the rate for pupils with no identified SEND was 8%, more than 3 times lower. A similar pattern is evident in permanent exclusions. Autistic students represent the largest SEND group affected by exclusions. We heard that for many students with SEND, exclusions from mainstream schools often stem from unmet SEND needs that are misunderstood and then interpreted and viewed as bad behaviour. Behavioural policies in mainstream schools disproportionately affect children with SEND, and I know this is an area in which Leon is doing very important work. I think it's a very important area of policy for the government to consider as it seeks to drive greater inclusivity in mainstream schools. There is no disagreement that school should be an orderly, calm environment in which everyone can learn, but an inclusive school must achieve this through behaviour policies which are informed by strong expertise in SEND and an understanding of behaviour as communication. One of the symptoms of the current crisis is that education, health and care plans are increasingly being used to fill gaps left by insufficient SEND support and inadequate ordinarily available provision, where parents feel that their children's needs are not being met and that applying for an EHCP is the only way to unlock the support they need. However, we saw evidence during our inquiry that if mainstream schools embed an inclusive approach, it is not always necessary to apply for an EHC plan to meet a child's needs. An example, one that we talk about a lot, that during our visit to Aylsham High School in Norwich, we saw and heard how the school's strong emphasis on high quality, ordinarily available provision alongside effective SEND support meant that many people's needs were met without the need for an EHC plan. The proactive and inclusive approach at the school appeared to reduce demand for formal statutory support by ensuring early intervention and effective approaches are embedded into everyday practice. EHC plans are a critical mechanism for ensuring accountability within the SEND system. They provide a legally binding framework that sets out the support a child or young person is entitled to receive, offering families a route to challenge decisions and seek redress when provision is inadequate or not delivered through mediation and through the SEND tribunal. They serve as a vital safeguard for those with the most complex needs. But the current levels of EHC plans are unsustainable. Our analysis is that the solution to this cannot be to remove statutory entitlements from a system which lacks accountability in so many other areas and in which parents and carers already have so little trust and confidence. The solution is to ensure that support can be delivered much more readily as soon as a need is identified. This would bring England in line with good practice found internationally, for example, in Ontario in Canada, where entitlement is based on need rather than lengthy assessment processes. The government's SEND reforms must not be based on any withdrawal of statutory entitlements for children and young people with SEND. The government must instead set out plans for reform which increase accountability across the whole of the SEND system, so that many more parents and carers can be confident that their children's needs will be met, regardless of whether they have a formal diagnosis or an EHC plan. The inspection framework for SEND, including Ofsted inspections of schools, early years settings and children's social care, area SEND inspections and the local government ombudsman, must all work to incentivise inclusive practice and to hold the system to account for delivering it. The committee is keeping a close watch on the implementation of the new Ofsted inspection framework, which will need to adapt to the government's SEND reforms. And we make several recommendations on the need for changes to the inspection and accountability framework to drive inclusive practice. And this speaks to the need to clearly define what is meant by inclusivity in mainstream schools. The government has expressed a clear intention to establish an inclusive mainstream education system. We welcome this focus, but the committee is clear that in order for mainstream inclusivity to be an effective mechanism for reform, there must be absolute clarity around what inclusive mainstream education looks like and means in practice for educators, education settings, pupils and families. Parents and carers should be able to understand what support they can expect to be available in an inclusive mainstream school and what to do when it is not being provided. Proper definitions and accountability are essential for rebuilding trust and confidence in the system. There is currently huge variability in ordinarily available provision and SEND support across the country and also often within the same area from one school to another. In some settings, pupils may receive tailored support, while in others the same needs may not even be recognised. The Education Policy Institute has found that the approach taken by a child's school to identifying SEND is a major factor in the child's chances of receiving support. It's essentially a lottery. They found that variation between schools accounted for 2/3 of the differences in SEND identification. And Susan Ackland-Hood, the Permanent Secretary at DFE, told the Public Accounts Committee in November last year that the 40% increase in demand for EHC plans has been caused by a lack of clarity about what children and young people with SEND should receive through SEND support, as well as the inconsistency of this support. She argued that it's really important that it's possible for people to get more support without having to go through the EHC assessment process. Our written evidence was clear. SEND support needs to be consistent, strong and effective if more children's needs are to be met in mainstream schools. The families of children with SEND highlighted the need to empower and fund schools and local authorities to provide interventions and support which may reduce the need for EHC plans. Our recommendation is that the Department for Education should publish a unified national framework for ordinarily available provision and SEND support. This should offer clear evidence-led guidance and include practical real-world examples tailored to educators and education settings, ensuring that all practitioners have access to quality-assured strategies and interventions. And our analysis is that it's not only a lack of clarity that is driving inconsistent and in some cases weak SEND support, but also a lack of accountability. Accountability in the SEND system is unevenly distributed both between parts of the system and between different parts of the public sector. It's no surprise that parents and carers feel forced to lean heavily on the EHCP part of the system, which has statutory accountability, when there is no meaningful accountability for ordinarily available provision and SEND support. And it's no surprise that there are significant failures in delivery when accountability sits primarily with local authorities who cannot compel health colleagues to deliver support and interventions that may be essential for a child with SEND to be able to access education. So we also recommend that the department should publish statutory requirements mandating the minimum resources specialist expertise and equipment that every education setting must have access to as part of their offer of SEND support in order to deliver an inclusive education. This will establish a clear, enforceable baseline covering staffing, training, physical materials and the physical environment and assistive technologies. It will also ensure that all schools and multi-academy trusts are adequately equipped to support children and young people with SEND through ordinarily available provision and SEND support. Clearer definitions, stronger accountability and proper resourcing of ordinarily available provision and SEND support can reduce the need for EHC plans over time. It's clear from the evidence that we received that leadership and a whole school approach is needed to deliver inclusion in mainstream schools. We heard time and time again about how the current school workforce is underprepared for teaching children with additional needs. In too many settings, the burden falls on the SENCO, who is often not part of the senior management team at a school. We believe it's important that SENCOs are embedded as part of the senior leadership team in every school, and that the workload of inclusion is not simply left to them. As a result, we are proposing a sweeping change in the education of the school workforce. We need improvements to initial teacher training, including a requirement to spend at least some time on a placement in a specialist school. And we need improvements to the early career framework so that new teachers can build on the more solid foundations that we hope they will develop during their initial teacher training. But every teacher needs to be experienced in SEND and to keep up to date with new developments. So it isn't enough for training to be improved for new teachers. We are also recommending a robust programme of continuing professional development for all teachers, not just those who are new to the profession. And we conclude that it's important over time, perhaps over a timescale of about 4 years or so, that every new teacher should have a specific SEND qualification so that whole school approaches really can be led from the top. In addition to improving expertise within the teaching and support staff workforce, we believe the government needs to address the chronic shortage of key specialists whose expertise is needed to ensure the effectiveness of our SEND system. Currently, the role and availability of specialists like educational psychologists and allied health professionals, including occupational therapists and speech and language therapists, is inconsistent within education settings. In too many areas, there is a shortage of these specialists. Some schools say that they find it difficult to buy in specialists, and that frequently the shortage means that they end up focused on carrying out EHCP assessments and writing plans, rather than being available to work in schools to provide advice and support to teachers and other school staff. By the time some children get to see a specialist, it can be several years since the need was identified, and they may have lost a significant period of education as a consequence of having to wait. I've talked earlier about improving the accountability of health services within the SEND system, but there also is a need for a clear workforce plan to help deliver the specialist staff needed to support children and young people with SEND. So we recommend a joint SEND workforce strategy developed between the Department for Education and the Department for Health and Social Care to ensure that we have the right number of speech and language therapists, educational psychologists, psychiatrists, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, and other health professionals to support the SEND system. And I've talked a lot about schools, but access to specialists is particularly important for the early years. We know that for many types of need, early identification and access to support is vital, and that for some types of need, particularly some speech and language difficulties, early support can address the problem completely. The early years landscape in England is fragmented, and it's even more inconsistent than the school sector. So a coherent approach to delivering the right expertise and support in the early years is vital. The key challenge sitting, I think, beneath kind of all of the areas where we need reform of the SEND system for the government is how to rebuild trust and confidence in the system. At present, there is very little trust and confidence in the SEND system amongst parents and carers of children and young people with SEND. So many families feel let down by inconsistent support, delays and unfulfilled promises. The most heartbreaking evidence we heard was from children and young people who told us that they had been made to feel that they were the problem. shouldn't happen to any child in our education system. We heard countless stories from families who have had to battle at every stage of their child's education, often only to find that the support that had been agreed to or even mandated through an EHCP didn't materialise. If the government's plans for SEND reform are to succeed, this trust must be rebuilt. Parents and carers need to feel confident that changes will genuinely benefit their children. On our visit to Aylsham High School in Norwich, we observed that meaningful and empathetic engagement with and support for parents of children with SEND is both achievable and effective. We heard how the school establishes regular contact with parents even before admission, helping to build relationships and trust, and giving parents confidence that their child would be understood and that their child's needs could be met without requiring a specialist placement. One parent, and I have to say this parent's story of their child's experience in primary school was utterly devastating. Their child, she described how in primary school the child had started to talk about not wanting to exist anymore because the failures were so extensive. And she described Aylsham High School as the shining light at the end of a very long, dark tunnel. So we know that with the will and with skilled teachers and support staff, it is possible to engage well with parents and carers. On our visit to Ontario in Canada, we saw a system where parents are kept informed and involved in such processes, and where that engagement is formally required by the system. Parents and carers in Ontario must be notified when their child is being discussed, and there is a legal right to be present at almost every meeting. So parents and carers are partners around the table in their child's education. This represents a much more collaborative and transparent approach than we have in England at present. And school leaders in Ontario told us that this model fosters constructive relationships between schools and parents, avoiding the adversarial dynamic often reported in the English system. They emphasise the importance of engaging parents early in the process, noting that clear, honest communication from the outset helps ensure understanding, build trust and manage expectations. And they also told us that the process that they have, the way that it builds relationships, also fosters much more compromise, that they said, you know, we can explain to parents what we can't do as well as what we can do. And there is a kind of clear basis of relationship that results in that give and take. So we think that such openness and a more formal role for parents within the system would undoubtedly be beneficial in England at the local authority level. Our inquiry concluded that to avoid causing undue alarm and to help rebuild confidence and trust in the system, parents and carers must be fully engaged and any reforms must be implemented gradually and in a carefully phased manner. And I'll end with this point. The SEND system is a good example, some might say an extreme example, of the malaise that has set in across far too many of our public services as a result of more than a decade of austerity, of ill-conceived, if sometimes well-intentioned reforms, a lack of political focus on public service delivery, a lack of grip and poor cross-party working, and cross-departmental working, which has left services unable to deliver against the expectations set for them, and public trust and confidence collapsing as a result. This challenge, the restoration of trust, must, in my view, be at the centre not only of the government's SEND reforms, but at the centre of the government's mission for the whole of public service reform. In a very challenging fiscal environment in which funding cannot be the only solution, although in the case of the SEND system, it must be part of the solution, this speaks to an urgent need for approaches which are relational, not transactional, which does not do to people, but works with them, which does not assume that it knows best, but involves people with lived experience in finding solutions that everyone can support. If the government can achieve this for the SEND system, and it is essential that it does, there will be much wider lessons that can be applied across our public services.